Revelation chapter 12 is a change in the narrative that John has been using. If you'll recall, John has been, after he gets to chapter 4, it's been a linear timeline that he's been giving us. Well, here he does something, or the Holy Spirit causes John to do something that helps us to understand not just the tribulation period, not just the book of Revelation, but the entirety of human history. Okay? So it's taking that linear narrative that he has been using and moves it and changes it to show us that from the very beginning, all of this stuff has been playing out. All of the stuff that we're reading in the book of Revelation is just a culmination of the spiritual warfare that has been happening since the beginning. So I'm going to read it in its entirety, and then we're going to come back and look at it piece by piece. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon and under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, and Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and power and kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heaven, and you who dwell in heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So there's a few things that we need to address in here. We need to identify the main players in this little drama that John has just laid out for us. So the first player we see is the woman. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 37. Does anybody remember Joseph's dream that got him in trouble with his brothers? It's found in Genesis chapter 37, surprisingly enough. Verse 9 of Genesis 37. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So Joseph God is giving Joseph a dream for a twofold purpose. He's showing Joseph his very own future, where we know the story of Joseph. His brother sell him into slavery, and he rises to rule, in essence, the land of Egypt, and they do in fact bow down to him, right? And that's how the nation of Israel comes to be in the land of Egypt. So the fact that John calls this a sign means it's not a person, but it's a symbolic thing. So who do you think the woman in Revelation chapter 12 is? Who do you think the dream was? The stars and the sun and the moon in Joseph's dream. Who did that represent?
The nation of Israel.
The nation of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So this woman is the nation of Israel. And she's giving birth. It's fairly easy to figure out who the child is that she gives birth to, because here it says the one she gave birth in verse 5 to a male child, one who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Well, who is that? That's Jesus, right? That's what Jesus is destined to do. So who's the dragon? Well, that's fairly easy too, because John tells us who the dragon is. The dragon is Satan. So what this is saying is, from the very beginning, Satan and God and Satan have been at war in the spiritual realm, and it's always revolved around God's plan of redemption. Satan trying to stop God's plan of redemption. That's what spiritual warfare is about. Satan and his people, Satan and his minions, are trying to thwart the redemptive plan of God that was going to be coming through the nation of Israel, right? It begins when Satan tries to destroy the family of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, by turning the brothers against Joseph. The second reason that God gave Joseph the dream is because Joseph is a prophetic picture of Christ, right? His father sends Joseph to his brothers, and his brothers turn on him and, in essence, kill him in their mind. They throw him into a pit, then he's raised out of the pit and sold into the slavery, but he goes to the Gentile nations, which is the story of Jesus, basically. God sends him to the nation of Israel there in Bethlehem. He begins his earthly ministry there at the Jordan River. He walks for 3.5 years, presenting himself as their king, but his brothers, the Jewish people, turn on him and eventually kill him. And then Jesus says, okay, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. I'm going to get for me a people from the Gentile nations, because the Jewish nation rejected him. So a partial hardening has come upon the Jewish nation until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, until Jesus has completed assembling his bride from the Gentile nations. Then he will once again deal with the nation of Israel, right? Which is the time period we're in now. But this is the same thing that has been going on from the very beginning. So does that make sense? What John starts this out with is in the beginning of the nation of Israel, and even before that. Before there was a Jewish nation, before God called Abraham, Satan tried to corrupt human DNA, because the Messiah was going to prophesy to be a human. That's the very first prophecy of Jesus, when God tells Satan that the seed of the woman, not the seed of the man, the seed of the woman, will destroy you. He says, you will bruise his heel and he will crush your head. So Satan understands from the very beginning there will be a virgin birth and he will be human. And he is the one that God sends to complete his plan of redemption and to destroy me. So from the very beginning, Satan has tried to change God's plan. Okay? Have I confused you too much so far? In verse 3, another sign in heaven appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Turn with me to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7 is Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts. And we get the 4 beasts, and let's just read it. Verse 1, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring in up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up on the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, the horns were the eyes like a man, the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. All right, Belshazzar has this dream, and Daniel interprets it for him. And what these are, it turns out that these are successive nations, worldwide empires. And you might say, well, they can't be worldwide. The Greek Empire was not worldwide. The Persian Empire was not worldwide. The Assyrian Empire was not worldwide. But scripturally, biblically speaking, from the Bible's point of view, when it says worldwide, it means from the Holy Land, right? The area around the world around the Holy Land. It's not considering the great Ming dynasty or whatever. It's not considering the Aztec Empire. It's talking about the world being that Mediterranean area around the nation of Israel and around the Promised Land, right? So we have in succession, we have the Persians, we have the Medo-Persian, we have the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And the Roman Empire is combined with the final empire, right? The final Antichrist's empire will be a revived, in some way, shape, or form, version of the old Roman Empire. Okay? So that was Daniel's vision that he interprets. Now here in Revelation chapter 12, we will get back to those in chapter 13. He sees a beast, the first beast, and it was like a leopard, it was like a bear, it was like a lion. In other words, the Antichrist's kingdom, the Antichrist's empire will encompass all of the attempts that he has used in history to destroy God's plan. He will be like the Antichrist empire, will be like the Persian Empire, will be like the Babylonian Empire, will be like the Greek Empire under Alexander, will be like the Roman Empire, but it will exceed them in its depravity. It will exceed them in its violence. It will exceed them in its power. But that's what John is talking about here. So let me be a little more specific. 7 horns. Horn in the scripture, symbolically and prophetically, it always stands for power, right? You have horn, you have power. There have been 7 world empires according to the Bible's outlook, right, that we just went over. 7 world empires in world history from the Promised Land's viewpoint. It starts with the Egyptians. Okay? The Egyptian Empire. What did the Egyptian Empire under Pharaoh try to do to the Jewish nation? Tried to destroy him. Tried to stop God's plan of redemption. They were followed by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire tried to destroy the nation of Israel, but God protected them. The Assyrian Empire was followed by the Babylonian Empire. Babylonian Empire tried to destroy God's redemptive plan, or Satan through the Babylonian Empire tried to destroy God's redemptive plan. The Babylonian Empire didn't work, so he replaced them with the Medo-Persian Empire, of who the Persians supplanted the Medes. So it's the Persian Empire. He, again, tried to use the Persian Empire to destroy the nation of Israel. Then the Greek Empire. He tried to use the Greek Empire under Alexander to destroy the nation of Israel and thwart God's redemptive plans. When that didn't work, then he brings up the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire went so far as to actually crucify the Son of God, right? But he tried to use the Roman Empire once again to destroy God's plan. God used the Roman Empire to scatter his people around the nations, which makes it much more difficult for Satan to come up with a way to kill them all at one time. But he has tried. At one time in history, the Christian church has tried to kill them. The Arab nations have tried to kill them. Germany has tried to kill them. We've had program after program after program trying to kill Jews. They were all inspired by Satan trying to thwart God's redemptive plan. Because here's what happened when Jesus hardened their hearts and turned to the Gentile nations. He says in one of the prophets, I think maybe Hosea, that it was prophesied that he will not come again. Jesus will not come again at his second coming until his people, that means the Jews, cry out for him, specifically him, Jesus, the Messiah. So it's not until the nation of Israel recognize that Jesus was in fact their rightful Messiah, the one sent by God to save them, and cry out in sorrow for what they did and ask him to come save them again. And this happens at the end of the tribulation. This is when Jesus will come back. Satan knows this. So if there are no Jews left to cry out for Jesus to come back, guess what? He's made God out to be a liar. And God can't lie, so Jesus will not come back if there are no Jews left alive. In case you're wondering why the world, throughout history, Satan has driven the world to so persecute the Jews. Jews are great people. One of my very best friends is they're great people. They're smart. They're hardworking. There are more Nobel Prize winners that come from the nation of Israel than the rest of the world. They're great people. So why does the world hate them? Most of the world, much of the world. It's because Satan is behind that hatred. Because behind everything is this spiritual warfare that John addresses, where Michael, the archangel, leads the armies of heaven, and Satan and his armies are fighting back. And here, at the midpoint of the tribulation, the war in the heavens is over. The war in the spiritual realm is over, and Satan is confined to the earth, right? Which is the trigger for the Great Tribulation, is what we talked about last week. Have I confused anybody? All right.
I guess a quick question I have is, does Satan know that he's like playing into God's plan? Like he can't get rid of the Jews people, or?
That's I've often asked myself that question, because he is intelligent. He's the highest created being. He was created the highest created being. So, but I think Satan's downfall was his arrogance. And arrogant people oftentimes look at a situation and say, I can do it anyhow. Because he still thinks he's better than God. So he still is driven by the belief that he can defeat God, even though he's just a created being. And there's no way. We understand there's no way, but I don't know if he's deluded himself or just, I can't get into his mind, so I don't know. And back to the 10 horns, and then in Daniel's vision, or in the vision in Daniel chapter 7, 3 of them are supplanted by the little horn. The little horn in that vision is the Antichrist. If you go back and keep reading Daniel. So at the beginning of the tribulation, when whatever trauma has happened to the world that has caused the world to surrender to the Antichrist's solution, that solution is to divide the world up into 10 administrative districts, or part of the world into 10 administrative districts. At some point, the midpoint of the tribulation, the Antichrist will take over 3 of them and supplant the leaders of those 3, and that will become his headquarters. So we'll get there later in the book, but that's what the little horn meant in Daniel chapter 7 and what the 10 horns mean here. Okay? So 7 heads were the 7 world empires. That's the Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Persia, Greek, Rome, and the revived Roman Empire of the Antichrist. Okay, and the 10 horns are the way that will function. All right, so then we have the war in heaven, verse 3. Or no, his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth, which is Satan and his third of the angelic realm. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. What happened to the babies in Bethlehem? What did King Herod do to the babies in Bethlehem? Remember, the angel came to Joseph and said, you got to get up and go. You got to run to Egypt. So Joseph runs to Egypt because the wise men came and told Herod that the king had been born. So Satan is trying to kill the baby from the very beginning. Verse 5, she gave birth to a male child, one is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So where is Jesus now? After they rejected him, crucified him, he rose from the dead, and he ascended up into heaven until the completeness of the Gentile church was made. And his people called out for him. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now here, the narrative switches back to that linear timeline, because now we're coming back to the time period we're talking about, the tribulation period. If you look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand that we'll get there next week. We'll begin to get there next week. The false prophet who will arise, we'll see him next week appear in chapter 13, will erect a statue of the Antichrist in the Holy of Holies in the rebuilt temple. That's what Jesus is specifically addressing right here. Daniel prophesied it, and Jesus says, when you see that happen, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is in the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for the women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And in those days not been cut short, no human being will be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So Jesus tells the nation of Israel, this is the only Olivet discourse, and is specifically a prophecy to the nation of Israel, not to the church. There are some things in the Olivet discourse that the church can pull out, but it is given to the nation of Israel. When Olivet discourse, it's a teaching from the Mount of Olives. That's just a fancy theological term I shouldn't have used. I apologize. You're welcome. So Jesus says, when they erect that statue, get out of town. Most scholars believe they are going to be going into the Jordan wilderness around the city of Petra. Anybody know what the city of Petra is? Look it up. It's fascinating. It's almost impossible to attack. The only entrance into the city of Petra is a narrow canyon, sometimes less than 2 horse widths wide. So just look up the city of Petra. And that's what most people think the nation of Israel, the survivors of the nation of Israel, will flee to when the abomination of desolation happens. Because Satan has been flung down to the earth, restricted to the earth, no longer allowed in the spirit realms. And he reacts in anger in his last gasp chance to destroy the nation of Israel. He comes after them. Okay, verse 7. And they'll be there for the second half of the tribulation period, the great tribulation. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And John's going back to the previous time period when it's just an overview, because this war has been going on a long time. But here is the culmination of that war. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So, this is at the midpoint of the tribulation, and God has finally had enough of Satan coming into his presence to accuse us of sins, which we did. We did commit them, but he constantly accusing us before God. And so, verse 10, and I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation, power, and kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of the testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. At this time, we're dwelling in them. So we're rejoicing at this act. And then he says, but woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. So Satan knows it's got 3.5 years. From the moment he loses the war in the heavens and he is flung down to earth, there are only 3.5 years left to run. Okay, 360 years. And when the dragon in verse 13 had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So once again, who's the woman? The nation of Israel. He's pursuing the Jews to destroy them, because he knows he's got 3.5 years to destroy every Jew on the planet. So there will be no Jew left to cry out for their Messiah. So this is his last desperate gasp to defeat God. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent in the wilderness. I don't know what the great eagle is. I know the word eagle in the Greek can be rendered messenger, which is sometimes used as angels. So is this a supernatural event where the angels pick the Jews up and run them to wherever they go? Or is it just poetic language? I don't know what the means by which the Jews will reach the place of sanctuary that God has for them. So don't even bother asking me. I don't know. And I doubt I will know. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, because there's that definite article in front of it's not given the wings of a great eagle, it's given the wings of the great eagle. So I don't know what the great eagle is. So the definite article means it's speaking about something specific. To a place where she is to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. That's 3.5 years. Times is 2, time is 1, and half a time is half. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Again, is this symbolic language, or is Satan somehow causing a flood to chase after them? And God causes the ground to open up and take care of the water. I don't know. It could quite possibly be that Satan causes a dam to bust or burst or something. I'm not sure of the water situation over there in the desert, to be perfectly honest. Or is this again poetic and symbolic language? Suffice it to say, there is an attempt by Satan to destroy them before they get to the place of safety, and God saves them. And God stops Satan any further attempt to destroy those who have fled to where God had for them. And that's why in verse 17, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Who is the rest of her offspring? Well, John tells us, on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So he gets so angry because God stops him from destroying the Jews. And he knows his time is over. If he cannot destroy the Jews, he's lost. And he will be thrown in hell for all eternity. He knows this. So in his great anger, he does everything he can to hurt God, which means destroying the Christians, those who have come to know Christ during the tribulation period. And that's when he turns from trying to destroy the Jews to making war upon the Christians, which we'll see throughout much of the rest of the book. Okay, questions. I know we're going to have questions, chapter 12.
Well, I have a question about the word dragon. Because as far as I know, dragons aren't real. So what word is being used there?
The word dragon, and that's what's used in the Bible. But before you say dragons are not real, just consider this: every single culture all over the globe, including the ones in South America, the ancient cultures in South America, the ancient cultures here in North America, the ancient cultures in China, the ancient cultures in Africa, the ancient cultures in Europe. Every single ancient culture has dragon legends. Every single one. And they're all extremely similar.
They breathe fire?
I don't know if they literally breathe fire or not. We got the bombardier beetle who sprays caustic chemicals out of his hind parts to that burn the victims, that, you know, as a protective mechanism. So could it be something like that? Sure. But is that I mean, but all of them have that aspect of dragons to them. So something that, huh?
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, do some study on dragons before we just toss them out of hand. Now, you know, fantasy dragons, I don't know what they would look like, you know, because obviously legends grow up, but there must be a kernel of truth that there was a great large beast that was frightening to people. And it's in every culture. Every culture. I mean, look at China. They got dragons everywhere. What was the flag of the English has a dragon on it, right? There's dragons all over the world. And the Aztecs had dragons. The Native Americans had dragons.
So are unicorns real then? They're in the flag of the Britain too?
I don't know.
Jeff, so I've been watching like a bunch of like videos, and there's a theory that ancient civilizations refer to dinosaurs as the dragons, and that the dinosaurs were actually killed in Noah's flood.
That's quite possible as well.
So.
That's quite possible as well.
Just
because,
a theory.
You know, slap some wings on a T-Rex. What's he look like? Look like a dragon, you know. And again, I know science says humans and dinosaurs did not exist at the same time. Well, they dug up a pot in somewhere in Honduras, Central America or something from thousands of years ago. It's got a picture of a man riding a triceratops. Now, if we're the only ones who have dug up bones and put these together, how did we get an anatomically correct painting of a triceratops a couple of thousand years ago with a man sitting on it? And that's not the only one. We've got there's many of ancient pictures or drawings of dinosaurs. Could they be dragons? I don't know. Could they have survived the flood? Because it would take them to survive the flood to equate the dinosaurs with the dragons. Because the ancient people's understanding about dragons, and they all have the same understanding about dragons, that occurred after the flood. So certainly Noah could have took some small dinosaurs, because God says 2 of every one of the unclean and 7 of the clean. So if they were alive at the time of Noah, they're part of the every one, or at least every kind. But it would have been babies. I don't think he's carrying a full-grown Pachycephalosaurus up there or something. But so either of those could be. The dinosaurs are equated with the dragons, and it probably is, be my guess. And I think the dinosaurs died off because of the climate change after the flood, because we went from a subtropical all over the world to now we got massive weather shifts and patterns and storms and such, and it was not conducive to them. That's what I think. Other questions?
Yes, I have one.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so in verse 3, you were talking about the seven heads and how they are empires.
Yes.
In Daniel chapter 2, they talk about the statue that has seven distinct parts that are made of just separate things. The head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, bronze, the feet, the legs, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I have researched some, and it says there's some correlation between the seven empires.
Yeah. Yeah, you're breaking up.
And I'm just kind of curious how you know it's the revived Roman Empire.
All right. The statue in Daniel, the head of gold and chest of silver and bronze and so on down to the toes, mixed miry clay and iron. They combine the empires beginning with the head of gold, which stood for the Babylonian Empire, right? If you read the interpretation of Daniel, the head of gold is the Babylonian Empire. It was to be followed by another empire, which is the Medo-Persian Empire, which was to be followed by the Greek Empire, which was to be followed by the Roman Empire, right? That's the legs of iron. The toes are mixed with iron and clay. So at one level, it will not be as strong as the Roman Empire. But at another level, it will still combine those aspects of the Roman Empire. So a revived Roman Empire. And there are other places in the scripture that indicate the Antichrist will arise from within the old boundaries of the Roman Empire. Okay. And at some level, the Roman Empire has never went away. That the West has kept the Roman Empire alive in the way that we govern ourselves. Pre-empire, maybe the Roman Republic, right? I mean, we have a Senate. That's what ruled the Roman Empire. The Senate. That's where we get the name. That's how we set it up. So at some level, the world has never lost. The Roman Empire has never truly went away, right? Because most of Europe was part of the Roman Empire. All of France was, all of Spain was, all of England up to the Hadrian's Wall, or the Antonian Wall later. And Italy, of course, and much of the Eastern Europe. And of course, we're a recipient of all of those peoples. You know, half of Germany was part of the Roman Empire. So at some level, the Roman Empire's influence on the world has never left. And when the tragedy happens that kicks off the tribulation, we will once again reinstitute that type of model. I hope that makes sense. And so, but the statue encompasses, it leaves off Egypt and the Assyrians, because those were in the past in Daniel's days. It just starts in Daniel's present and presents him with the future. And in other words, that statue symbolizes the same thing that the beast here does with the seven heads. It encompasses the fact that Satan has been behind all of these empires throughout history. That it's just his different attempts to destroy the nation of Israel.
So the Antichrist could come from America then?
If you want to interpret it that way, yes, but it seems to indicate that the Antichrist will arise from the physical landmass that produced the Roman Empire. And there's some indication it will be from Syria or somewhere around the Holy Land, because that was part of the Roman Empire as well. So I don't want to get too specific guessing where the Antichrist is going to come from, because there's all kind of wild theories out there. But there is some indication that yes, it will be from the actual land that comprised the original Roman Empire, and further indication that it may be somewhere close to the nation of Israel. So it could be quite possibly an Arab, somebody of Arab background or Muslim background, who the Muslim that makes peace with the nation of Israel will be celebrated all over the world if he can make peace between the Arab nations and Israel, even temporary. Other questions? All right, things will be getting hard next week. No, not too hard. We just take it slow. And listen, guys, when we're going through this, stop me instead of waiting till the end to ask questions. I don't mind it at all. So that way you won't forget what you had a question. So no other questions?